I'm here just to share a little bit about a process that I've developed over the last 25 years that we found to be really effective and helpful to our churches, particularly in our part of the country, in dealing with strategic planning. All of us know what Benjamin Franklin said: if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And I've certainly found that to be true in my years of ministry, as well as in the years that I've spent here in the Minnesota-Wisconsin Baptist Convention. I found also that most of our churches do not plan at all. In fact, a few minutes ago, when we were listening to Scott talk about the levels of churches, if you looked at his figures, you're talking about at least 80% of our churches that fall into the latter two categories of churches that he described that were basically languishing and didn't have a direction at all. And I've found that in the smaller church, particularly in bivocational churches, but when I say smaller churches, I'm really going up into the 300s as well, that the majority of our churches are living on a cycle of basically 7 days. They live from worship service to worship service at best. And if they do anything more than that, it's primarily a little calendaring, but they don't do anything that looks like strategic planning at all. And as a result, they really just languish, as he described, and they continue to fall down the backside of the life cycle curve. A couple of years ago, I was invited to preach at a church that I knew really well, that I'd belonged to when I was in college. And the pastor asked me to come early just to visit with him. And when I showed up, he took me down into a conference room where there was a small group of people that he had brought together to ask me a couple of questions. And one of those questions was, why did the association start a church in town where we already exist? Well, as you can imagine, that was a loaded question. I did know a little bit of the reasoning behind some of that, and it was something that I knew they didn't want to hear. But the next question was why is that church growing and we are not growing? And so I reached over onto a whiteboard that was in that same room, and I drew this life cycle curve that probably all of you have used at different times. And I asked him, I said, so where do you think you are on this life cycle curve? And the conversation started off, one guy said, well, we have more money than we've ever had in our history. And then somebody else kind of paused, and she sheepishly came to the floor and she said, but I heard about a time 10, 15 years ago when we had 300 people here and we were the center of the community. And we were doing things with the community. We were reaching people, and people were being baptized, and people were coming to know Christ and entering into the ministry. And in each one of these situations that they mentioned along this journey, they kept coming back to days of the past when things were better. And so I asked him, I said, where do you think you fit on this life cycle curve? And this is where they put themselves. And I found over the years that I've had this conversation over and over and over again with people, and they always mark themselves ultimately worse than I would have had the guts to tell them face to face. But it's the beginning of a moment when they stop and they begin to ask themselves, okay, so what's next? And so when I begin putting these materials together in the book format, where do we go from here? They were materials that I had been using for years in response to that very question that groups came up with. Where do we go from here? And I tried to share with them, as I do in the book, how it is that we're going to change regardless. And if you look at the life cycle curve, either we're going to continue to go downhill or we're going to change and possibly enter into a new life cycle. That's a mind-opening statement for most of these churches that literally have done nothing to rethink who they are or what their future direction might look like. And it begins to get them percolating to the point where they will ask me straightforward, so what do we do now? And this book and these materials are designed for a church that maybe hasn't asked that question yet, but is beginning to ask that question. Most of us know Henry Blackaby's statements, which have impacted us as Southern Baptists, and continue, I find, to impact many of the churches that are in the greatest need across our convention. They still use the Blackaby materials, but they haven't lived them out in any significant way. Blackaby says you cannot stay where you are and go with God. You cannot continue doing things your way and accomplish God's purpose in his ways. For you to do the will of God, you must adjust your life to him, his purpose, and his ways. I often share that with them and let it sink in, because they've accepted something at some level that they've not been personally willing to apply within the church itself. When I came to this point years ago when I was pastoring, there were significant materials out there to begin this process of planning. And I have to admit that when I started off, even though I had a background in business administration and in finance, I found that churches didn't want to plan. And so initially I gave into that, and I would try to do some level of planning, but no significant strategy to push forward. But when I came to Northwest Iowa and the church began to grow, I began to look for tools that would help me along the journey. And Master Planning by Bob Beal was one of those significant books that began to impact my thinking on planning. And Albrecht Malfer's book on advanced strategic planning is another one of those books. And in more recent days after that fact, of course, Will Mancini came forward with Church Unique. But I remember that as I began to adopt some of the principles of these books in a process, I had to distill it down to the point where a smaller church could possibly do this. I remember still writing in the margin of Albrecht Malfer's books. I got on page 85 or whatever it was, and I wrote in the margin, I don't know a single pastor that would do all this. And that was an overwhelming feeling for me when I began to realize that there was nothing out there that fit a church of 200. There wasn't anything out there that fit a church well of 100, that the processes were huge. They were excellent, and they continue to be excellent, but most churches would not bite off something that big. So I began putting together this process and began working it in our mission churches. And then when we came here to Minnesota and Wisconsin, in intentional interims and then in conferences. In fact, Mark Millman had me do the very first presentation of this for his association years ago before the book was ever written. But I designed a process that is simple, it's Bible-centered, it's pastor-led. You can start it quickly. It doesn't take very much time at all. In fact, a 3-hour process gets you going. And it's an ongoing process that you can revisit over and over again to lead our churches forward. It's based on this very simple arrow, the arrow concept I borrowed from Bob Beal in his master planning arrow. I continue to use that in a significant way, even within the convention work, because it's detailed and yet it's visual. But bringing that down to the local church level, the congregation can get a feel for this as well. And so when I lead a church in this process, and what I've written for pastors to be able to implement is a beginning of calling the church to prayer, significant prayer. In fact, we as a convention did 40 days of prayer when I challenged our churches to begin this process in their own local church. Significant prayer, calling out to the Lord to lead us and to guide us and to oversee the process of thinking together, praying together, and planning together strategically for the future. Then getting together for a meeting that we discuss the next things on the list, the history, the functions of the church, the assessment of where we are right now, the brainstorming of ideas that might lead us off into the future, an evaluation of those ideas, and then a plan that's put together for that purpose. All of this occurs in 3 hours in most churches. I've done this in churches up to about 250 to 300 people. And the larger the church is with the more leaders, sometimes we've gone to 2 sessions of 2.5 hours to be able to do it. But most churches can pretty comfortably press through this in about 3 hours. And you can see something of the organization that I just mentioned with the time commitments that are there to work through and process these things to come to the end where we can actually have a preliminary plan together to step forward tentatively into the future from. So again, we begin with the process of prayer. We move into a time where we discuss the history of how God has shaped us and moved in us in the past. And I continue to be surprised at how many times there are strong threads in our history that we still have resources and capability in, and nobody really knows why we quit doing what we were doing or how we could do it differently. But many times the history begins to shape the future for us and gives us an understanding of how we might have some things we've overlooked in the past. So we celebrate the past. It gives us an opportunity to celebrate the people of our past, sometimes significant leaders of our past, and to think through who God shaped us to be. Then we go to the third step, which is to look at the functions of the church. This is a strong biblical process. I've always found that if you can share from the Bible with Baptists what something might look like, they're open to it. And so rather than starting with some theories and we've got to connect and all the good things that are part of a much more comprehensive process, I start with the scripture and say, okay, let's go to Acts chapter 2, and let's just take a look at what the scriptures give us as a snapshot of what the church was experiencing after the end of Pentecost. And so we read the passage of scripture, we discuss the worship aspects, the evangelism, discipleship, fellowship, and ministry of the church. We get a snapshot of what I think a biblical church looks like at its simplest point. So then we move to an assessment time period where we assess ourselves. So what does that look like in our church? How are we doing in regards to worship and evangelism and discipleship and fellowship? And I usually do this pretty informally, and I spell this out in the book, but I take 3x5 index cards. I give them to each participant. I have them write out an answer, a score in a numerical way, and then give me comments. I give them all the same color pen. I collect the cards, and then I read them out. It's amazing how honest people are when they have some kind of cloaking and don't have to say it in front of everybody. But it gives us the opportunity to assess where we're at. If we say we're evangelistic and we haven't baptized anybody in the last year, well, then something's not quite right there. If we say we're good disciples, but we can't really see that there's a systematic way that we're growing disciples, and God's not raising up leaders in our congregation, we begin to see that there are problems there. So we do this assessment in that way, and we talk about those pieces of what it looks like to be a church. Then we go through a process of brainstorming where we begin to assess. I should mention Scatterus is working on a digital assessment for me right now, where we could actually include the entire church in this process and give a readout. So we're real close. We have a beta on that. I'm going to run it in the church I pastor here in March to see how it works the first time. They'll finish it up and they'll make it available, which will give us a more comprehensive inside assessment of who we are. But then we move to the brainstorming session of the process. And you guys do this all the time. These are tools that we all know. It makes us feel comfortable with it. But we do an evaluation. We have a conflict of ideas that are brought to the table. We get whiteboards out. We write all over them. Every idea that comes out, you know how to do that, where you're able to get as much out of the group as possible and ideas that you can distill into something meaningful. So we brainstorm those ideas. We don't evaluate them when they come out, and we feel free to build on ideas. This is not to sound too mystical, but this is the part where God always shows up. It amazes me. We pray for God to show up, and in these conversations, he does. And he brings some things to the table that have been transforming for churches as a result of these brainstorming sessions. When we're done with the brainstorming, we then begin to evaluate these different pieces that have been brought to the table. You'll begin to see a clustering of ideas that begin to work. During that brainstorming session, you'll start to see that, hey, you know what, we got some resources, we have some people, we have some connections, we have some facilities that may implement some of this. You'll see some of that come together in the evaluation process. And I lead them through to pray through, discuss, and analyze and prioritize some of the things that came out in the brainstorm that by this point they think might be next steps for us. And so we'll check those things out on the wall. We'll begin to analyze those and evaluate those, and then we'll prioritize 2 or 3 of them, never more than 3, that might be possible things that we could begin to do and implement and see happen within our church. We use a typical SWOT analysis to do that. Again, most of our people are familiar with this tool. It allows us to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats of each of those different ideas, evaluate which ones. Many times God has already given us everything we need, really, to be able to step forward in. And sometimes we see problems that will take those pieces off the table. When we're done with that, when we evaluated all of that, when we come down with those 2 or 3 things that we think we might be able to do, then we begin to plan those things. And again, we use a common tool that everybody is familiar with, basically SMART goals, that will allow us to set trackable goals to implement the process. For one of the churches that I did this with before I wrote the book, they decided that they thought they had a great possibility of doing an after-school ministry in a community where they had the facilities. They knew there was a need in town. The community even voiced that need. They had a recently retired teacher that was energetic and excited about the possibility. And so they decided they were going to implement the goal of starting a Monday through Friday children's ministry that would run from 3:15 to 5:15. They knew that their facilities could easily handle more than this, but they set a measurable goal of 15 students for the first semester that they offered this. They believed there were at least 50 students in the community that could respond. They knew it was relevant because they'd seen great weakness in their areas of ministry and evangelism within the church, and they felt like this idea was a possible response to that. And they set a timely deadline of starting that ministry on August 25th, which coincided with the beginning of school. So they had definite goals set that would begin the process of implementing this. Then we put together a very simple sheet, and you can see it here. It can be longer than this. I discourage it being much longer than this, but in a planning sheet where they simply lay out the steps that are necessary to get the ministry up and running. They date the time period and the person responsible for each of those steps, and they deadline them, and then they track these things to make sure that they're implemented on time and in the manner necessary to implement the ministry. And then they simply implement the ministry, begin operating whatever changes, and then repeat. I encourage churches to do this at least on an annual basis, and I've done this in the church I pastor for the last 6 years as well. It's a reminder that strategic planning is not an event, it's an ongoing process. And I would just say, as I come to the conclusion here, even though this is not a giant comprehensive process and there's so much more of it we could do, this is doable. And I've had church after church after church that has said no to any strategic planning for years, say we can do this. And they've done it, they followed through, and they've implemented something on into the future. When I came to Emmanuel Baptist Church here in town, it was dying, it was in trouble. We were down to 30 people. It had been our key church planting church for years, and it's where my wife went to church when I was on the road most of the time. I asked the board for permission to take it on as a project and plan the church. And the first time we went through the process, we chose to implement 3 things. That was probably too aggressive, but for where we were at the time, we did implement all 3 of those things and then came back to the table 6 months later to implement some more. But one of the things was this room was just ugly as sin. It was worn out. We had used it with 2 of our mission churches. The carpet was stained and worn out. The colors were ugly. The screen was the focal point of the entire room. There was nothing in it at all that shouted, "We love Jesus," or "We worship God here in this place." It was just ugly. This picture was one of the last pictures I could come up with. It gives you something of a feel. The pews were falling apart. We'd had actually a couple of them fall apart and break in the process, which was rather embarrassing. When we went through the process, we said we got to do a renovation. And so we began to implement the process of setting up a committee to work through and to do some decorating and some changing and replace the carpet. And I was stunned that when somebody actually put a plan together and began to work it, in the next 3 months, we were able to raise over $125,000 with only 30 people, and that included kids at the church, to do a renovation of the room that would make us more attractive than what we had been in the past. And you can see as a result of what came to place on there in that room was stunning. It changed the spirit and the attitude of our church. We realized at that point that the only open door we actually had yet was our Sunday morning services, and they were unattractive. And so this was one facet of what we put in place as we begin to press forward on some ideas. I can tell you that the exciting thing now is the church is over 4 times that size in spite of COVID, and is strong and doing well, but we continue to work this process on an ongoing basis, year after year, to see what God would do in us in the future. All of this is played out in a process in the book. Where do we go from here? Strategic planning for the smaller church. It's out on Amazon. The easiest way is probably just to type in my name, Leo Endel, and it's available. I dropped the price for this event. The book is available right now for $7.99 a copy. I have a Spanish edition that we translated. Again, we dropped the price on that, and there's a Kindle edition as well. This is a process that you as an associational mission strategist could put in the hands of your pastors of churches that are just stuck or not going forward, and see some transformational work proceed and build up the strength of the pastor who could lead this process, perhaps under your mentoring or your coaching, to really change a church and see it enter into a new life cycle.